Some time ago, I had a conversation with a professor of philosophy in one of the American universities, and he told me that he was an atheist and that he couldn't understand how any intelligent person could embrace Christianity, because at the very heart of the Christian system of thought was a manifest contradiction. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, the doctrine of the Trinity. He said, the doctrine of the Trinity is a contradiction, and intelligent people don't embrace contradictions. I said, well, I agree with part of that. I grant you that the intelligent people ought not to embrace contradictions, though many of them often do. I don't think that I agree with you that intelligent people should not embrace contradictions. I said, but what surprises me is that you would classify and categorize the Christian doctrine of the Trinity as a contradiction. Not that it's surprising to me that people do that from time to time. But what surprises me is that you are a professor of philosophy and you are doing this, because I'm assuming here, perhaps erroneously, that as a professor of philosophy you've been well trained in the science and discipline of logic and know enough about logic to know its fundamental premise, the law of non-contradiction, and are carefully trained to know the difference between a contradiction and a paradox. Let's look at it. I said, I grant that the formula for the Trinity is paradoxical, but it is by no means contradictory. And let me show you why. The historic formula is that God is one in essence and three in person. I said to my philosophy professor friend, I said, certainly you can see that what this formula is saying is that God is one in one thing and three in something else. Now, to break the law of contradiction, one would have to say that God is one in essence, and only one in essence, and God is three in essence. Or saying God is one and only one in person, and at the same time say that God is three in person, because the simple definition of the law of non-contradiction is that something cannot be what it is and not be what it is at the same time and in the same way or in the same relationship. Now, I can be a father and a son at the same time, but not in the same relationship. I cannot be my own son or my own grandson. That's obviously impossible. And so when we look at the formal categories of rational thought, we see, objectively I hope, that this formula is not contradictory. And this was one of the things that the church struggled with profoundly in the first 4 centuries in order to be faithful to the clear teaching of Scripture that on the one hand, God is one, and on the other hand, that Christ is divine, that the Father is divine, and that the Holy Ghost is divine. Now that's no mean feat to be able to resolve this apparent contradiction, because at first glance it looks as if the Christian community was confessing faith in 3 gods, which would violate the principle of monotheism that was so deeply entrenched in the Old Testament. Well, let's look at the word paradox for a moment. The word paradox is based upon a Greek root and a Greek prefix. The prefix para means basically alongside of. You've heard of parachurch ministries. You've heard of paratroopers, paramedics, paralegals. They're people that work alongside of other people. And so a parable is something that Jesus throws alongside of a teaching that he gives to illustrate a point. Well, para means alongside, and the word dox here comes from doctors. Paradox are two doctors. Right, Roger? Paradox is two doctors? Paradox. No. No, the word here comes from the Greek word dokein, also from which the heresy of Docetism is known and derived from this same word. And that verb, in its verb form, means to seem, to think, or to appear. Now, so from those words we get the idea of a paradox is something that, when placed alongside of something else, seems or appears to be contradictory. But when you look at it more closely and subject it to careful scrutiny, you see that in fact it is not a contradiction. And that's what I was asking this professor of philosophy to do with respect to the Christian formula for the Trinity. It may seem to be contradictory because we're saying God is one essence and three persons, and we are accustomed in our vantage point as human beings to see one being is one person. We can't conceive of how one being could contain three persons and still only be one being. Now, to that extent, the doctrine of the Trinity in this formulation is mysterious. Nobody's arguing that point. And it boggles the mind to think of a being who is absolutely one in his essence of what he is, and yet within that single essence are three persons. Now, we also have to talk about the meaning of these two terms. Because again, why this seems to be contradictory is because we have a tendency to see these terms, essence and person, as virtual synonyms. Because this man is a being, he's a human being, but he's also a person. And we, again, as I said, we are accustomed to thinking one person per being. we don't think, unless he has multiple personalities, then we take him to the psychiatrist at this point. But we think one being per person, one person per being. Now, the concept of essence comes from the Greek word, again, another Greek word. It comes from the Greek participial form of the verb to be, which is the word ousia, which means being or substance, or, well, my favorite translation of this in the vernacular is the word stuff. When I was going to school in Holland and I had to learn the Dutch language, of course, my priority was to learn the theological language, but my wife's priority was to learn what they call the house, town, and kokental. That is the house and the town and the kitchen language, so that she could go shopping and make a different distinction between a turnip and a green bean. And so she was busying herself with that sort of thing. And of course, one of the appliances that one would use in a culture that was meticulous and finicky about cleanliness was a vacuum sweeper. But the word for vacuum sweeper in Dutch was the word stofzuiger, which literally means a stuff sucker. These people are really imaginative in the way they name their new products. Well, what's that thing? Well, it's a stuff sucker. You know, what do you think it is? Look at it. It sucks up all the stuff that you find on the floor. Now, we could have given it a much more sophisticated, ontological, metaphysical term than stuff sucker. But I like that word stuff because What is the stuff? I mean, this is, what's the stuff of which you are made? What is the stuff that distinguishes a human being from an antelope, or an antelope from a grape from God? There is the stuff of deity, the essence, the ousia, the substance of what God is in himself. And what the church was saying is that God is one essence. There's only one stuff. There's not part of God here, and then separated from that is another part of God over here. That would be two beings. And God is only one being. And so, well, what do we mean then about saying that God is one in being, but three in person? Well, that's a little more difficult. Part of the problem we have with it is that when this formula was derived in the early church, it was derived from the Latin roots of the word person that we get. And the word was persona. And its primary function in the Latin language was as a legal term, or as a term that was used in the dramatic arts. You're all familiar with the trademarks for the world of drama, the twin masks indicating tragedy and comedy. You got a smiley face for comedy, and you got a frowny face for tragedy. And they are portrayed in masks, fit over an actor's face. I remember a long 100 years ago when the modern version of the book of Job was cast into a play that was held on Broadway called J.B. And in that play, one distinguished actor played two different roles. And it was Basil Rathbone, who played the Sheriff of Nottingham in the classic Robin Hood, and who played, of course, for all those years with Nigel Bruce, he played Sherlock Holmes. Well, Basil Rathbone played the role in J.B. of God and of Satan. And when I went to see that, when I was in high school, we had tickets that were literally front row center. I could have reached out and tapped Basil Rathbone on the arm while he was doing this performance. But what was so vivid to me in my recollection of that performance was that when he would change identities in the play, when he would indicate that he was being God, he would hold up a mask in front of his face that was the mask of God, and he would speak through that mask as he assumed the personality or the character of God. Then when he was Satan or the devil, he would hold up a different mask. And this followed the ancient custom. In Greek drama, as well as in Roman plays, it was customary for actors that were highly trained to play more than one role in a play. They were doing something from Euripides, for example, or so on. Somebody could have more than one part. Now, the way they did it then was to distinguish their persons by speaking through these masks. And the Latin word for the mask was the word persona. So that when people like Tertullian, for example, first spoke of this formula of the Trinity and talked about one being, three personae, he was saying that there are three roles, as it were, that God is playing here, that is manifested on the one hand as Father, and the other hand as Son, as the other as the Holy Spirit. And so the point of all of that is that the idea of person in this formula does not correspond exactly to our English concept of personality. Because again, for us, one person means one distinct being. Now, in technical theology, in order to make the distinction in the Godhead among the persons of the Trinity, other terms have been used. My favorite one, which I think is most helpful, and I hope is not confusing to you, is the word subsistence. Subsistence. Now, that's probably not a word you're too familiar with in terms of its theological use. You may hear it from time to time with respect to somebody's eking out a living on a very poverty level form of existence. In fact, we call that extreme level of poverty what? A subsistence. That they're basically surviving. They are not existing, they're subsisting. And we're indicating that subsistence as a below par level of life. Okay? Now, again, the reason why we sense this as something low or below something else is because of that prefix. We all know what the prefix sub means. It means under or below. A submarine was not an airplane in World War II. It was a boat that went where? Under the water. There you go. All right. So, now what about this sistence here? Well, we see the common term between subsistence and existence. When we use the term existence, it's a common daily word that we use, and yet it's one that's filled to the brim with all kinds of philosophical and theological assumptions. I gave a lecture once at an Orlando conference where the whole point of my lecture was to deny as emphatically as I could and as categorically as I knew how the existence of God. And when I began that lecture, I said, what my task is today is to convince you folks that God does not exist. Came this gasp from the crowd. What are you talking about? What kind of game are you playing with? I'm not playing. I said, the worst thing that could ever happen to us is to discover that God exists in the specific meaning of the term exist. Because the term exists in our language has derived etymologically from the Latin existere, which means, ex means out of, and stere means to stand. So somebody who exists is somebody that's outstanding. But outstanding in what sense? Well, what was meant by this word philosophically centuries ago, going all the way back to Plato and before Plato, was the idea that there is being, pure and simple. And pure being depends on nothing for its ability to be. It is eternal. It has the power of being within itself. It is by no means creaturely. The thing that characterizes in our last session, we explored how the 19th century atheists, in seeking to understand why mankind seems to be incurably religious, that they came up with multiple theories that would say that religion is a result of the inventive, creative imagination of human beings who simply don't have the moral courage to face the cold, stark reality of the ultimate meaninglessness of human life, so that there is a psychological impulse, a psychological need out of which, in order to escape grim reality,
people formulate for themselves in their own comfort the idea of a God who hopefully will rescue them from meaninglessness. Now, when I mentioned at the beginning of this course how I used to teach a course in atheism where I required my students in the graduate school to read the primary sources of the atheists, and that as we analyzed them, I looked at the epistemological patterns that we've explored, questions of causality and rationality and so on. But also, if you recall those earlier lectures, I mentioned that almost to a man, the critics of theism came back to this principle that the real impetus for theism is grounded in human psychology. And because of that, several years ago, I undertook to write a book for lay people to give them a brief introduction to some of these skeptical philosophers and to show how the New Testament responds to it. And the original title of this book, which is now in paperback, was called The Psychology of Atheism. The title now is If There's a God, Why Are There Atheists? In other words, I'm playing on the principle we talked about the last time, where the 19th century skeptics were saying, if there is no God, why are there theists? And their answer was psychological need. And so I'm asking in this book, if there is a God, why are there people who deny his existence, and so on. And early in the book, I have a discussion of why it is that great thinkers disagree. We've mentioned that in the past, that some of the most brilliant thinkers in all of history have come to both ends of the pole. Though I radically disagree with Jean-Paul Sartre in his understanding of reality, I certainly don't think that he's a dummy. Jean-Paul Sartre was one of the most insightful, engaging, acute thinkers of the modern era. And certainly John Stuart Mill was also a giant in terms of his intellectual power. He was prodigious, obviously, as was Kant and Hume and Feuerbach and the others, Nietzsche. And yet on the other side of the coin, you have people like Aquinas and Augustine and Anselm and the Titans historically who have defended the theistic arguments. And so it's not just a question of superior intellect, that the difference among people may be because the evidence was incomplete for one group or the other. Somebody made logical errors, and we know that brilliant people can disagree because of epistemological errors of one sort or another. But I said one of the factors that has to be included in this whole debate is the psychological factor. Let's agree right up front that the question of the existence of God is indeed loaded with psychological baggage. I was at a soccer game last night, and I was sitting next to a man who was getting more and more exercised by the referee's calls because he felt that the referee was favoring the opposing team. And he asked me about it after the game, and I said, you know, I used to be a basketball referee when I was in seminary, and I can tell you this, that when I was refereeing basketball games with another guy, and if the place was filled to capacity, I knew that there were only two people in the whole room who didn't care who won the game. And it was me and the other ref. I said, because we didn't have a bias, we really didn't. But everybody else in that room had a bias. And they see plays through that. They anticipate, they think somebody's going to foul the person, and even if they don't touch them, in their eye, they see the foul and want to know why I didn't blow the whistle, or so on. And so we know that, and we all have experienced that as we root for our favorite teams in sports and the like. That we as people are capable of looking at the evidence through a lens that favors our own bias. And I have to say before the whole world that every bone in my body wants there to be a God. I can't stand the thought that my life is a useless passion. And so I have to admit that it, not only that I have that desire, but I also agree with the skeptics that it is possible for people to construct philosophical systems on the basis of their own desires, on the basis of their own prejudices and biases, and have that cloud their thinking. And I also want to say, in the final analysis, the reality of the existence of God cannot be determined on the basis of what I want to be true. And I agree with the critics of Kant that just because life would be meaningless without God, that's not sufficient grounds to argue for the existence of God. All that really describes is the state of our subjectivity and of our desires. It doesn't prove God one way or the other. But one of the things that I think we have to understand is that everybody who gets involved in the discussion of the existence of God is dealing with the same psychological baggage. Because for those who deny the existence of God, there is an enormous vested interest on their part for the denial of the existence of God. Because God stands as the greatest obstacle in the universe to my own autonomy. If I really want to do my own thing with impunity, then I know that the highest obstacle to that would be a self-existent eternal God who is righteous and who is just. And that if I have ever sinned and have not repented of my sin, I know the worst thing that could befall me would be to fall into the hands of the living God. And so denial is not just a river in Egypt. I will do anything in my power to deny my guilt and to deny my culpability, even to the point of denying that I am accountable ultimately